Chopi Jana Palapa Girivaradari Chopi Jana Palapa Girivaradari
Śhrīmad is very great. A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada ki, Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda ki, Grantaraj Śhrīmad-Bhāgavatam ki, Sam Beta Bhakta Vrinda ki, Gaur Premanandi. All glories to the assembled devotees, all glories to the assembled devotees, all glories to the assembled devotees, all glories to Sri Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Ajnanatimirandasya Gananjana Shalakhaya Chakshur Anmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Shtapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamahyam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavams Cha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatan Bitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhunam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhanvitam Cha Hey Krishna Karuna Sindho Dinabandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Rishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpa Tarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. All right, so here is our verse today, 2.2.35, I believe it is, number-wise. Bhagavan sarvabhuteshu. This is the correct verse, right?
Yes.
Okay. Bhagavan sarvabhuteshu. Lakshita svatmana harihi. Lakshita svatmana harihi. Drishyar buddhyadhibhir drashta. Drishyar buddhyadhibhir drashta. Lakshanayar anumapakai. Lakshanayar anumapakai. Bhagavan sarvabhuteshu. Lakshita svatmana harihi. Drishyar buddhyadhibhir drashta. Lakshanayar anumapakai. Bhagavan sarvabhuteshu. Lakshita svatmana harihi. Drishyar buddhyadhibhir drashta. Lakshanayar anumapakai. Bhagavan sarvabhuteshu. Lakshita svatmana harihi. Drishyar buddhyadhibhir drashta. Lakshanayar anumapakai. Ladies? Bhagavan sarvabhuteshu. Lakshita satmana harihi. Drishyar buddhyadhibhir drashta. Lakshanayar anumapakai. Bhagavan sarvabhuteshu lakshita satmana harihi drishyar buddhyadhibir drashta lakshanar anumapakai. Bhagavan, the personality of Godhead. Sarva, all. Bhuteshu, in the living entities. Lakshitaha is visible. Swātmana, along with the self. Harihi, the Lord. Drishyai, by what is seen. Buddhi adibihi, by intelligence. Drashta, one who sees. Lakshanai, by different signs. Anumapakai, by hypothesis. The verse translates, the personality of Godhead, Lord Sri Krishna, is in every living being, along with the individual soul. And this fact is perceived and hypothesized in our act of seeing and taking help from the intelligence. So I say it, you please repeat. The personality of Godhead, Lord Sri Krishna, is in every living being, along with the individual soul. And this fact is perceived and hypothesized in our acts of seeing and taking help from the intelligence. Okay, so here is the purport by Srila Prabhupada, and it's a long one. The general argument of the common man is that since the Lord is not visible to our eyes, how then can one either surrender to Him or render transcendental loving service to Him? To such a common man, here is the practical suggestion given by Srila Shukadeva Goswami as to how one can perceive the Supreme Lord by reason and perception. Actually, the Lord is not perceivable by our present materialized senses. But when one is convinced of the presence of the Lord by a practical service attitude, there is a revelation by the Lord's mercy, and such a pure devotee of the Lord can perceive the Lord's presence always and everywhere. He can perceive that intelligence is the form direction of the Paramatma, plenary portion of the personality of Godhead. The presence of Paramatma in everyone's company is not very difficult to realize, even for the common man. The procedure is as follows. One could perceive one's self-identification and feel positively that he exists. He may not feel it very abruptly, but by using a little intelligence, he can feel that he is not the body. He can feel that the hand, the leg, the head, the hair, and all the limbs are his bodily parts and parcels, but as such, the hand, the leg, the head, etc., cannot be identified with his self. Therefore, just by using intelligence, he can distinguish and separate his self from other things that he sees. So the natural conclusion is that the living being, either man or beast, is seer, and he sees besides himself all other things. So there is a difference between the seer and the seen. Now, by a little use of intelligence, we can also readily agree that the living being who sees the things beyond himself by ordinary vision has no power to see or move independently. All our ordinary actions and perceptions depend on various forms of energy supplied to us by nature in various combinations. Our senses of perception and action, that is to say, our 5 perceptive senses of 1 hearing, 2 touch, 3 sight, 4 taste, and 5 smell, as well as our 5 senses of action, namely 1 hands, 2 legs, 3 speech, 4 evacuation organs, and 5 reproduction organs, and also our 3 subtle senses, namely 1 mind, 2 intelligence, and 3 ego, 13 senses now in all, are supplied to us by various arrangements of the gross and subtle forms of natural energy. And it is evident, it is equally evident that our objects of perception are nothing but the products of inexhaustible permutations and combinations of the forms taken by natural energy. As this conclusively proves that the ordinary living being has no independent power of perception or of motion, and as we undoubtedly feel our existence being conditioned by nature's energy, we conclude that he who sees is spirit, and that the senses as well as the objects of perception are material. The spiritual quality of the seer is manifest in our dissatisfaction with this limited state of materially conditioned existence. That is the difference between spirit and matter. There are some less intelligent arguments that matter develops the power of seeing and moving as a certain organic development. But such argument cannot be accepted because there is no experimental evidence that matter has anywhere produced a living being. Trust no future, however pleasant. Idle talks regarding future development of matter into spirit are actually foolish, because no matter has ever developed the power of seeing or moving in any part of the world. Therefore, it is definite that matter and spirit are 2 different identities. And this conclusion is arrived at by the use of intelligence. Now we come to the point that the things which are seen by a little use of intelligence cannot be animate unless we accept someone as the user of or director of the intelligence. Intelligence gives one direction, like some higher authority, and the living being cannot see or move or eat or do anything without the use of intelligence. When one fails to take advantage of intelligence, he becomes a deranged man. And so a living being is dependent on intelligence or the direction of the superior being. Such intelligence is all-pervading. Every living being has his intelligence, and this intelligence, being the direction of some higher authority, is just like a father giving direction to his son. The higher authority who is present and residing within every living being is the super self. At this point of our investigation, we may consider the following questions. On one hand, we realize that all our perceptions and activities are conditioned by the arrangement of material nature, and yet we also ordinarily feel and say, I am perceiving, I am doing. Therefore, we can say that our material senses of perception and action are moving because we are identifying with the self with the material body, and that the superior principle of super-self is guiding and supplying us according to our desire. By taking advantage of the guidance of the super-self in the form of intelligence, we can either continue to study and to put into practice our conclusion that I am not this body, or we can choose to remain in the false material identification, fancying ourselves to be the possessors and doers. Our freedom consists in orienting our desire either toward the ignorant material misconception or the true spiritual conception. We can easily attain to the true spiritual conception by recognizing the Superself or Paramatma to be our friend and guide, and by dovetailing our intelligence with the superior intelligence of Paramatma. The Superself and the individual self are both spirit, and therefore the Superself and the individual self are both qualitatively one and distinct from matter. But the Superself and the individual self cannot be on an equal level because the Superself gives direction or supplies intelligence, and the individual self follows the direction, and thus actions are performed properly. The individual is completely dependent on the direction of the Superself, because in every step the individual self follows the direction of the Superself in the matter of seeing, hearing, thinking, feeling, willing, etc. So far as common sense is concerned, we come to the conclusion that there are three identities, namely matter, spirit, and superspirit. Now, if we go to Bhagavad Gita, or Vedic intelligence, we can further understand that all three identities, namely matter, individual spirit, and the superspirit, are all dependent on the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The Superself is a partial representation or plenary portion of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And Bhagavad Gita affirms that the Supreme Personality of Godhead dominates over all the material world by his partial representations only. God is great, and he cannot simply be an order supplier of the individual selves. Therefore, the Super Self cannot be a full representation of the Supreme Self, Purushottama, the absolute personality of Godhead. Realization of the Super Self by the individual self is the beginning of self-realization. And by the progress of such self-realization, one is able to realize the Supreme Personality of Godhead by intelligence and by the help of authorized scriptures, principally by the grace of the Lord. The Bhagavad Gita is the preliminary conception of the personality of Godhead, Sri Krishna, and the Śhrīmad-Bhāgavatam is the further explanation of the science of Godhead. So, if we stick to our determination, pray for the mercy of the director of intelligence sitting within the same bodily tree, like a bird sitting with another bird, as explained in the Upanishads, certainly the purport of the revealed information of the Vedas becomes clear to our vision, and there's no difficulty in realizing the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Vasudeva. The intelligent man, therefore, after many births of such use of intelligence, surrenders himself at the lotus feet of Vasudeva, as confirmed in Bhagavad Gita 7:19. Wow, what a purport. Bhagavan sarvabhuteshu lakshita satmana harihi drishyar buddhyadibhir drashta lakshanar anumapakai. The personality of Godhead, Lord Sri Krishna, is in every living being, along with the individual soul. And this fact is perceived and hypothesized in our acts of seeing and taking help from the intelligence. Okay. So that monster purport is basically about three subjects. Just to kind of, oh no. Did I unplug myself? No. It's about three subjects, as Prabhupada in his purport wraps it up towards the end. He says, we're talking about matter, the self, and the super self. Those are the three things being talked about in this purport. Matter, the self, and the super self. And during the course of the purport, Prabhupada uses at least two, maybe it's three, sort of thought experiments as we would call them in our modern terminology. He uses them as thought experiments to help us to understand some important points that are clearly quite central in Vedic comprehension. So this is also the point where our modern, what I call 21st century mythology. So generally we think that in olden times people had some mythology, some gods and some mysterious forces, but nothing has changed. In the 21st century we also have mythology, we have our gods and mysterious forces. Of course, they are described in somewhat different terms these days than they were at one time, but the modern human being is as much a product and limited by and confused by his own mythology as people of bygone days might have been. So science, in our scientific view, is by no means an exception. Although generally we hear over and over again ad nauseum that science deals with reality and truth, and religion and philosophy deals with faith, and therefore science will win. This is, a nice kind of argument as long as you don't examine it very closely. But one of the things that Prabhupada is talking about here is a bugbear in our modern view of the world that has gone on for centuries. It's not a new thing, it's a long-standing thing. What is perception? So a lot of what's being described in this verse is a look at or a rehash of what we call the 24 elements of Sankhya. So the reality that we live in, the reality that we experience, the reality around us at all times, is described in Vedic literatures via a process known as Sankhya, which is touched on to some extent in, I believe, the third canto, where Kapila Dev describes it to his mother, Devahuti. And this Sankhya describes 4 groups of 5 things. 4 groups of 5. So 4 times 5 is 20. Then we have 3 things on top of it: mind, intelligence, and false ego, which here Prabhupada calls the subtle senses. In many other places in Vedic literature, they're described as the subtle elements. So it's interesting. They can be viewed either as senses or as elements, which is interesting. Nothing particularly wrong there, just it's interesting that one place they're classified in one way, another place they're classified in another way. All right, so the 4 groups of 5 are the 5 gross senses, the 5 knowledge-acquiring senses, and the 5 working senses, which Prabhupada enumerated. The knowledge-acquiring senses are the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the ears, and the skin. We acquire information from our outside environment through the 5 Gyan-indriya, as they're called in Sanskrit, knowledge-acquiring senses. Now, we have 5 working senses, or karmendriya, senses that we output. So we get input into our bodily cavity from the outside world through the knowledge-acquiring senses, and we get to experience or output into the world through our working senses, karmendriya. The arms are working, the legs are working, the tongue works, I'm working it right now, speaking. And then we have the anus and genitals, which also output various interesting substances. At any rate, these are the senses. And this is part of reality. So if we want to understand reality, we have to understand that there are gateways and and levers that go out into the material world, the working senses, the knowledge acquiring senses. Now we move into the two other groups of five, which are the five gross elements: earth, water, fire, air, ether. Those are the gross elements. That's matter. That's what scientists call, they have their periodic table of elements, which is up to something like 116 or something like that now, 118. The elements that are in the world around us. And then we have this unusual category, which for us is hard to grasp oftentimes, the tanmatra, the five subtle sense objects, which are form, touch, taste, smell, and sound. These are subtle sense objects. What in the world are these? And where do they fit when we discuss these objects with someone who is a product of 21st century mythology? Where do they fit? Interesting question. And believe it or not, there is a place in modern philosophy where these items fit. And that is in the world of phenomenology. There is a school of philosophy that started in the mid 19th century, I believe it was, and went out of fashion and then came back into fashion, and it was called phenomenology. It was started by a man named Edward Husserl, and well, at least he made it famous or popular. Before, there were others who hinted at similar concepts, Thales in Greece, and Franz Brentano, who was a ex-Catholic priest, But at any rate, this idea of phenomenology discusses something that scientists never talk about. They never talk about, but it's something that's so basic that all of us are immediately aware of it. And it has a name in phenomenology or in other similar views of things, and it's called the, what's the name now? Qualia. It's a strange word. Qualia. Qualia. And this word, as Daniel Dennett puts it, is a strange word for probably the most familiar thing to a human being, and that is sense perception. Now, how is this different from what the scientists talk about? And I will give you a thought experiment that will bring it right to focus, In our modern 21st century mythology, with all of its scientific trappings, we say light is coming from those, halogen, power beam bulbs up there, and it's bouncing off the skin of my body, and it goes into your eyeballs. And there's a lens, okay? And the lens is convex, and therefore the light flips upside down. It focuses in the middle of the eyeball, the jelly in the middle of the eyeball, and it goes on the back of the retina, upside down. And there are rods and cones in the back of the retina, and those rods and cones can perceive various colors. And what they do is when there is a bright light, they pulse out electrical impulses. And when the light is not so bright, not so many impulses get pulsed out. This then, on both eyeballs, goes into what's known as the optic nerve. It touches the eyeball at what we call the blind spot. And the optic nerve crosses over the right eye, the nerve coming from the right eye crosses over the nerve coming from the left eye. and disappears into the brain. And so now we've gone from light to electrical impulses that are moving down the nerve channels in the axons and dendrites in the nerves of the optic nerve, and it disappears in the brain. Neurologists will tell us that now the brain in various parts will process, not in the same place, but one part of the brain processes the color, another part processes the motion aspect of what's going on, another part processes the familiar faces, and another processes something else. Okay, now the $60 million question is, what happens next? And that's where science has no answer. What happens next? It's like an 8-lane freeway. We're going great guns. We're talking about electrical impulses. We're talking about light. Scientists have all this stuff down. And suddenly it just disappears into a forest. There's no exit or anything. The freeway just stops, What happens next? And that's because science does not understand the tanmatra, or what the phenomenology people called qualia, which is sense experience. I'm seeing you, you're seeing me, I'm hearing you, you're hearing me. It's an experience. I'm not seeing a bunch of little, elves and fairies inside my head, riveting together different aspects of sight. And you don't look to me to be inside my head, you look to be out there. So somehow or other, we have this thing we call experience. What I just described about the light coming into our eyeballs and doing all this stuff, this thought experiment, we could say exactly the same thing about the television camera. Light goes into the television camera. It goes through a lens. It doesn't shine on rods and cones, but it shines on various light-sensitive phosphors, which also exhibit or exude an electric current when certain light is shined on them. And then, there's all this gadgetry to scan it in a various way and put it into a digital file of ones and zeros, et cetera, et cetera. But essentially, exactly the same thing I described happening in the eye is happening in the camera. But there's something different about the camera. Who's the ultimate buyer? Who's the consumer at the end of the whole chain? In the camera, we have to wait till someone looks at the camera. And then it goes from the camera into that person's eyes and goes through the next same cascade. Somewhere, who's the final, where the buck stops? Where does it stop? We have a thing we call experience. I don't experience electrical things coming out of my eyeballs. I experience sight. I don't experience electrical stimulation coming out of the cochlea in my middle ear, which is stimulated by various sound vibrations. I experience sound. It's an experience. Humans have experience, as Prabhupada is saying here. Even animals have experience. They experience something. Cameras don't experience anything. They simply process the input. And so this is this mysterious tanmatra, the objects of experience, and we have various objects of experience that are all actually riveted together as one complete thing. We experience the world. I experience sound at the same time I'm experiencing sight. We are not the senses, and this is a thought experiment that Prabhupada uses quite often. We know that we have a hand, but we are not the hand. If I cut off the hand, I still exist. I mean, be unfortunate, but I still exist. We know that we have an ear, but we are not the ear. You know, if we lose the ear, we still exist. We know we have eyes, but we know people who have maybe for some, you know, accident or whatever lost their vision. Either the eyes are actually have been taken out or they've just become blind, and still the person exists. So I'm not my eyes, I'm not my ear, I'm not my hand, I'm not my, legs. Then what am I? And the answer is we are consciousness, or what's known in the Vedic system as the jiva, the individual soul. We are not the super soul, we are the individual soul. We are a piece, a particle of consciousness. And as we've been talking about all this yoga system business, even a yogi who sits peacefully and meditates, controls his air, his breathing, and tries to still the consciousness, can experience what it's like to experience just consciousness, minus any external input from the external world, Now, this is something that even a common person can do. At least, I would say some percentage of common people can do. Maybe not for a long period of time, maybe not in a deep way, but if you meditate and you are able to still your consciousness, you can experience what it's like just to exist minus sense perception, which is what the yoga system's all about. You're supposed to come to that stage. Then gradually you start exploring the, life errors and all this other business. But that is an experience. Of course, again, this is all stuff that science completely puts the police tape on. We can't go there, we shouldn't talk about it, it doesn't really exist. And the only way to talk about these things is through thought experiments. Even the phenomenologists described it that way, that you can only talk about these things through thought experiments. There's no other way to talk about them because they don't allow themselves to be reviewed in the same way that external scientific data does. But nevertheless, when the scientist is looking at his altimeter, when he's looking at his barometer, when he's looking at his chronometer or his pH measuring device or whatever he's looking at, he's looking at it through a sensory experience. So this is something that the Vedic system is bringing out. And so Prabhupada describes this, and then he allows us to go a little deeper and understand that we are above the material body. But then also, we are not the super self. The super self rather gives us information in intelligence. And this comes back to our, famous painting that we've seen in Bhagavad Gita of the 5 horses, and you've got the intelligence being the driver, and the reins being the mind, and the frightened soul with a white face going like that next to the driver in the chariot. And all the horses have one of the senses as a little breastplate on the horses. And this is, there's a verse in the 3rd or 4th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, Indriyani paranya hor indriyeva paramana manasastu parambodhe sabudhe paratastu saha, I think is how that goes. So this verse describes a hierarchy. The senses are superior to dull matter. That's how it starts out. So sense objects cannot see, they cannot hear, they cannot move. That's what Prabhupada's making the point of here. Senses can hear, can see, can move, but not matter. Matter cannot. The camera can process the data of light into electrical pulses, but it can't actually experience it. So The senses are higher than dull matter. Higher than the senses is the mind. Higher than the mind is the intelligence. And he, the soul, is even higher than the intelligence. And so we understand the way it's supposed to work is that the intelligence directs the mind controls the senses, and the senses therefore engage with some of the full spectrum of external sense objects and not with others. Of course, in general, the external world is so large that the senses can never engage with all the possible sense objects, but in everyday situation, what is happening is the intelligence is not choosing based on scripture. It's choosing based on what we recognize as being more important sense gratification, not less important sense gratification. So we all have our trees of what beats what, in sense gratification. This kind of sense gratification is better than that kind of sense gratification. If I see a $100 bill and at the same time somebody's telling me, here, come take a flight in an airplane and leave the $100 bill behind, I think, well, I'll take the $100 bill. We have some kind of, what beats what, what's more important sense gratification. And this is generally how human beings operate. And this is wrong. This is why people go down the tubes, because this is their way of choosing. But actually, we're supposed to choose based on the scriptural reference. So scripture is what's supposed to direct our senses, as we know that we should simply try to live in a way where we accept what's minimal for keeping our body and soul together and use our body, all full 10 senses, for serving the Supreme. That's how we should direct it. And Scripture gives us some clues as where to direct the senses towards and what to direct them away from. So this is what the intelligence is supposed to be doing. But generally it's not doing that. Instead it's choosing based on better sense gratification, on the cue of what's better sense gratification. So the thing that we call intelligence, as Prabhupada is describing in a further thought experiment, he's describing that within the consciousness we get clues. This is like this is like that. We get, sometimes we call them intuitions, sometimes we call them, the conscience. There's many names in our modern society for this strange supersoul talking to us in our interior, giving us some understanding. So we call it all these things. Sometimes, we say that animals have a particular nature or some kind of instinct, we call it. This is the supersoul. The supersoul is directing us. We all have had times where somebody came to us and we knew right away that something funny was going on, and we followed our intuitions and we were delivered from what could have been a difficult situation because the supersoul told us something, In this way, we are constantly getting clues or cues from within. And it's this intelligence that's actually coming from the supersoul. So the supersoul is giving us this information. And we utilize it, but the materially conditioned person thinks that this is my intelligence that's talking to me. Whereas if we're a devotee, we recognize this is the intelligence of the supersoul cueing me in. This is what's really happening. And in this way, we begin to understand that, as Prabhupada says, there is a perceiver of the intelligence and a director of the intelligence. So there's a talker and a listener. Someone is on the receiving end, someone's on the speaking end. We're on the receiving end, Krishna is on the speaking end. So that is what we call the Supersoul. The Supersoul is speaking to us. And as Prabhupada said, one more distinction in this particular verse. God, so much to plow through in this verse. That the Supreme Personality of God is not just telling us what to do to keep us from falling in the mud. He has got his own life and he's doing something else, you know. Krishna is enjoying in Goloka Vrindavan, he's doing so many other things. And only a portion of him, the Paramatma, is doing this function of keeping us from, falling in our face in some particular situation or directing us through some kind of confusion. All right. So I've tried to cover many of the things that have been kind of talked about in this verse. It's kind of throwing a lot at you, but this whole chapter is like this. And this whole chapter really helps us to understand how the world works according to the Vedic viewpoint. And we can see it when we compare it to the modern 21st century mythology of our everyday world and its scientific pretensions, you know. So when we compare these two, we can kind of see which one talks about the deeper picture and how to possibly explain this same viewpoint to those who are coming from 21st century mythology. All right. Questions, comments, whatever. Yes, Krishna Kripa.
Your analysis of sight reminded me of something that in kind of when I worked with Sadhguru Prabhu, that we talk about the five senses. We talk about the sense of sight, but you were talking about the eye and the optic nerve and the visual processing centers of the brain, and those are all made out of gross matter,
right?
Water, fire, air. So they're different in this subtle sense of sight. Well, there's some empirical evidence of their difference in the phenomenon of the near-death or out-of-body experience.
Right, right.
When the body's not functioning, there's no blood going to the brain, and therefore all that processing isn't going on, but the people are still experiencing themselves floating above the body and seeing how the doctor's trying to resuscitate them. And the most amazing case was studied by somebody named, I think his name was Candrasekhara, and he studied people who had been blind their entire life. They'd never seen anything, but they had a near-death or out-of-body experience where they perceived things.
Mm-hmm.
So that showed that it was definitely something completely different than the physical apparatus of it.
Right, right.
And not only that, when they saw things in that state, we just see, like, I see the front of you. You could have like a hole in the back of your curva and I couldn't see it, you know. But they saw 360 degrees around in that state. So that shows that this subtle sense of sight is something like completely different than they know anything about.
Yeah, that sounds like the work of Michael Sabum. You know, he did many. He was a cardiac surgeon, and he had experiences where patients that came to him with, or were referred to him during cardiac arrest, you know, that they would later explain to him what he was doing. And technically, according to medical bioscience, that shouldn't have been possible. That, as you say, that when cardiac arrest happens, there's no blood going anywhere. That means the brain is zipped completely out. Nothing is happening there. No electrical charges going on there. So there should be no perception whatsoever. And in many cases, indeed, that's true. But in some cases, as we see people pop out of the body, and they describe the whole procedure from an external viewpoint, which defies all materialistic explanation, because there's a lot of weird things like that. There's also hydrocephalia, which is a very strange phenomenon that's usually called water on the brain. but actually it's better described as water and no brain. So some people, you know, we've seen these pictures of the human brain with the, gray matter, I think, on the outside and the white matter on the inside, or maybe it's the other way around, you know. So there's this thin film on the outside of the brain, and on the inside is this other kind of nerve tissue, or whatever you want to call it. But some people have all that missing. And instead, there's just water there. There's just a thin layer. And in a darkened room, you can put a candle beside the person's head, and you can see through their head. And naturally, you know, people who have hydrocephaly, many of them have serious mental problems. But researchers discovered some of them are in college. So you then wonder, what's going on here? You know, essentially this person's got most of the gear missing, but somehow they're able to still cope with a college level education. Something, you know, it just suggests that there must be more to it than matter. And so this other aspect, you know, phenomenology, or this idea of sensory experience and qualia, are discussed. But science doesn't know what to do with them. But materialistic science has to shut the door on these things. They can't talk about them because that's woo-woo area for them. You know, once they go down that road, then we can start talking about a spirit or a soul, and this is all anathema in 21st century science speak. So, but nevertheless, for people that we meet on the street, for people that we deal with, you know, these kind of things, I think, kind of help them to understand that there's a world beyond the narrow view that gets presented most of the time on television and in our popular media and so many different platforms of 21st century materialistic limited science, you know. So that's why I bring this up. Prabhupada's using these thought experiments here. And by, you know, thinking about them, then we can describe to people what might be missing in the worldview of materialistic science, you know, when we talk about the senses, biology, and all these things. What's missing? Well, qualia is missing. Where does it fit in? Consciousness is missing. Where does it fit in? And in modern science, there is no, consensus on where these things fit in. In fact, it's a wide spectrum, a wide and very controversial spectrum of what the modern scientific viewpoint is of what consciousness is. It goes all the way from non-existent altogether to the thing that's becoming popular now is something called panpsychism. Prabhupada talks about this phenomenon. He says there's been no example of a life coming from matter anywhere, at any time. There's no scientific experiment that shows that. You can ask any scientist. As a matter of fact, Swarup Damodar, while he was still with us, did ask some prominent scientist at some symposium on science that if I give you, oxygen, carbon, we won't begrudge you a little bit of phosphorus or sulfur if you need it, or hydrogen or any of these other things. Can you make life? And the answer of the scientist was, I don't know. That was how he replied to it. And so this shows that life is something that is not just physical chemistry. We can have all the stuff that we know of goes into life, but somehow we can't do it. Of course, you read in the popular media, in papers, and in the internet, and on various other things, that the scientists have created life. But they've never really created life. All they've done is caused an egg to somehow become fertile in some unusual way, and they call that creating life. But that's not creating life. They can never create a functioning being from basic building blocks of raw matter. They cannot do it because no one has ever done it, and Prabhupada claimed that no one would ever do it. Certainly they can, gestate an egg in an odd way or cause one to subdivide or whatever. That's possible, but that's a whole other thing. That's not creating life. So these things help us to get a grip on how the Vedic system views reality, how we break it down. Knowledge acquiring senses, working senses, 5 gross types of matter: earth, water, fire, air, ether. 5 subtle sense objects, which are the tanmatra, as we were saying, qualia. Then you have mind, intelligence, and false ego, and the soul. And as Prabhupada says, the soul and the super soul, they're not matter. Whereas all the rest of the other 23 things in Sankhya philosophy, it's all matter, either gross or subtle matter. It's all matter in some way or another. The senses are matter, the knowledge and working senses, the sense objects, the subtle sense objects, they're material. The 5 gross elements, they're material. And the subtle elements, false mind, false intelligence, and false ego, those are all material. All that's material. Only the soul is spiritual. And besides the soul, there is a overseer and permitter, upadrashtanumantas cha. So there is an overseer and permitter, which is the super soul. And he is one fragment of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna. All right. So I've gone over. Are there any final questions or comments? Yeah.
Really interesting. So we're actually in one of my classes. I'm in a neuroanatomy class, and we just learned about the dendrites and like the perception, sense perception. And my teacher was talking about how he's starting to get a little bit esoteric and kind of stop about how all of our senses are different. Like in the general consensus, all of our senses are given to us to ultimately forget Krishna in the general sense, but like my forgetfulness of my senses is completely is a different variant than hers or yours or anybody else's. So really you kind of see how we trust this body and the externals, the cameras and all these, and like a computer, but as a toddler you see that you're trying to experience it because you're new into the body, into this form. But so a child would put this in their mouth. Now I know this is the iPhone, I know how much this costs now that I've experienced some time with this object, so I know that that's not a good idea. So it all comes down to really taking shelter of the holy name and trusting that, because that puts everything in its proper relation, because you don't know how to relate to things, you don't know how to relate to it on a superficial level, actually. Because intuition, I know people who say, oh, intuition to go do some bad thing, because Super Soul in his Paramatma form, he's doing both. He's giving you the material things you want and also the spiritual things until you're inclined to actually want the complete spiritual thing, which he wants you to want, but he doesn't force it.
Right.
So really the holy name is the name.
So what is intuition, which is actually super soul, and what is the combined material desires and trends from many past lifetimes, which is actually our false ego talking to us, those are very difficult to distinguish unless we have the benefit of Scripture, which helps us to distinguish between those two. And that's why, most people's life is based on the collection of trends of material desire from many past lifetimes that come to us through our wonderful agency of our false ego. So yeah.
So you were saying before, in regards to sense perception, that our eyes receive information, they go down the neural pathway, and then it goes to our brain. Then what happens? Wouldn't you just be able to argue that we have storage centers in our brain that retain memory, and then based on whether the action provided a benefit or harm, then we're just conditioned into certain behaviors that create this so-called intuition.
Yeah, you could, go a total reflexive theory. In fact, some, investigators of, neuroscience do go that way. That, we're just like a when you tap your knee with a rubber hammer and your leg goes forward, that we're just a reflex, But you've got, a couple of hundred people in a room playing a Mozart concerto on various instruments, and this is some kind of reflex, it just kind of beggars belief. The thing that I'm pointing at, which is what Prabhupada points to, where is the unifying principle that ties it all together? What is the final buyer of the whole thing, that we experience the world as a conglomerate, seamless totality, at one time. But we see that sense perception, from the scientific viewpoint of electrical charges, is spread out all over the brain in all kinds of places. Where is the thing that ties it all together? What is that thing? That neurology doesn't have any answer for, as far as I know. There's no single, place in the brain where it all finally comes together and it's dealt with. And again, we could say that it's all reflexes, but I don't feel like a reflex. I feel I'm making choices.
I don't mean so much as a reflex. I just
right.
mean conditioning. Like
yeah. Right. Right.
If it results in something good, then we continue the behavior. If it results in something bad, like if you were chewing on your phone at a certain point in time, you realize there's not going to be a benefit to that.
Right.
So we change our behavior over the course of time. And the second thing I want to ask, you're talking about creating life. So
right.
How do you enter a discussion in regards to like artificial intelligence?
Right.
So
right.
That not creating life? Like we don't know what the perception of artificial intelligence is, or to what extent it will develop over time.
Right. Well, there's a lot of special interest in AI at this point, and AI is being given godlike, properties by the popular media. Which is, I think, overblown. I think AI certainly can do many things better than humans, but regular computers can also do many things better than humans. But there's some things they can't do at all. You could ask a simple question: can you make a computer, AI or even quantum computer, feel pain? How would you do it? It's one of those questions that, it shows, again, we run up into that brick wall of qualia. Where do we go from representations to actual experience? For experience, there has to be an experiencer. And pain is probably one of the experiences that the senses have that defies categorization in a scientific way, completely, We see that, they say it's C fibers firing. Okay, we know that much. And we say that, but how would a computer feel pain? What would you do to make a computer feel pain? If you start thinking about, computer architecture, I do a little bit of work with computers and programming and things like that. I can't think of any kind of structure that you could make a computer to feel something, a physical, somographic feeling, something that is a actual, what we call an experience. Computers can see, they can talk, they can react, they can process information. Nobody doubts that. That's certainly possible. But can they actually experience something? Just like the camera, the robot can see things, hear things, process things, make decisions. In many cases on the battlefield, can even exterminate people. But does the robot feel anything? Can it actually experience anything? It's just, at the end of the day, running through a group of algorithms, either mechanical or digital, and responding, and that's all, you know. It doesn't feel remorse, it doesn't feel satisfaction, it doesn't feel anything, and it has no will of its own. The computer, I mean, sometimes we definitely feel like our computers have a will of their own, but actually the computers are, you know, unable to make choices for themselves. They make choices based on what their programmers have asked them to make. Of course, hypothetically, you could build a computer that would make random choices, which I don't know why you'd build such a computer. There'd be no market for it. But in that case, the computer would be like useless for all intents and purposes. But still, it's following a random grouping of things, whereas human beings, and for that matter, all sentient beings, they make choices, and for the largest part, it's based on a hierarchy of sense gratification. But for devotees, we're the only people in the universe who make choices knowingly based on scripture, not on the basis of better or worse sense gratification, but on the basis of how we can recognize that we are servants of the Supreme. So anyway, I think these topics are good to go over because we have to encounter people who are entrenched in various ways of looking at things. And, you know, we try our best to try to look at these things and regurgitate them in a way that would be effective and would communicate to people in our modern world. You know, that's what it's all about, I think, you know. So at any rate, I've kept you all too long, and Prasadam's waiting. So thank you all for your kind attention. All glories to Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam. All glories to the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord.